Welcome to the Mission First People Always podcast. We're glad you're here. And now our host, Dr. Mike Patterson.
Do you ever feel overwhelmed by the number of meetings you attend and wonder whether your time could be better used elsewhere? According to research referenced in the Harvard Business Review, executives now spend an average of 23 hours per week in meetings. This is up from about 10 hours in the 1960s. Are the extra hours spent in meetings making us more or less productive? That's the question we're going to tackle on today's episode. More importantly, we're going to find out how we can do fewer meetings and make the meetings we do have more productive while making our team stronger. This is Dr. Mike Patterson, your host of the Mission First People Always podcast, and I'm glad you're here. It's going to be a great episode.
Welcome to the Mission First People Always podcast, where we talk about better business results, stronger teams, more successful careers, and happier lives. Along the way, we hope to bust some biases, build some bridges, and have some fun. We're glad you're here. And now, our host, Dr. Mike Patterson.
My guest today is Yadi Ising. Yadi is the founder of the Ising Agency, a firm offering operations, recruiting, and administrative support for stretched thin in-house teams. Before launching her agency, she was the director of client operations for a staffing agency where she built teams that thrive together. She has a background in television production, media, and communications, and has managed live events and built in-house creative teams for Fortune 500 companies. For the last decade, she helped get the right people in place to build the most efficient and productive workflows. Yadi Ising, welcome to the Mission First People Always podcast. I'm glad you're here.
I'm glad I'm here too. Thanks for having me, Dr. Mike.
Well, we are recording this the day before Thanksgiving, so I appreciate you, Yadi, taking time away from your Thanksgiving preparation to be with me. It's a great day. We've got a lot to be thankful for. And I think this conversation is going to be one that the audience thanks us for because we are drowning in meetings. And we're going to talk about how we can become more productive with less meetings and feel better about ourselves and the work we're doing. So I'm excited to have the conversation. But first, here on the Mission First People Always podcast, we emphasize the importance of relationships and knowing each other's stories. So, Yadi, tell us a bit about your story, how you beat the odds. And you mentioned to me when we were chatting before that you didn't grow up with a lot of advantages, but you overcame some odds that were stacked against you to become a successful business leader. What is your story?
Yeah, it's one that I think will start back on the day that I was born, really. I was born to a teen mother. She was about 17 when she had me. And I also grew up in probably what would be considered one of the most dangerous cities in the nation. And so from the start, I didn't have much of a bright future if statistics were proven correctly. But over time, I really focused and decided that my life was going to be different than what was around me. And so I worked myself through college and eventually, made a career for myself that I'm incredibly proud of. So yeah, it was an interesting journey, but I'm here and I'm thrilled to be able to tell that story.
Well, congratulations on that. I'm thrilled for you, Yadi. There are so many people that grow up in tough situations and don't make it out. And so I'm committed, I'm sure you are as well, to lend a hand wherever we can to help people not be stuck. Let's jump into our conversation. Several years ago, Patrick Lencioni wrote a book with a great title. I love this title. And the book I'm talking about, of course, is Death by Meeting. Why is it that meetings suck the life out of us?
Yeah, I think that my answer to that is going to be twofold. One is that meeting culture has definitely changed since the pandemic because it is a physical or a virtual, in this case, representation of, quote, how busy you are. And so the more meetings you put on your calendar, the busier you look, and the more that, the better you look to the people that are looking at your calendar or looking to put time on your calendar. So that's kind of like the default that I think puts us or paints us into a square that gives us the opportunity to have them suck the life out of us, right? So, and then the other part of my answer is that when you're sitting in meetings, typically, if the meeting isn't relevant to you or you're not an active contributor to the meeting, you tend to multitask and you can't really focus your energy on the things that you're supposed to be doing to, quote, move the needle when you're talking about your day-to-day work. So as you're jumping from meeting to meeting, there is a such thing as meeting fatigue, right? You're jumping from meeting to meeting and you're having to kind of switch up your mindset. So not only are you distracted during the meeting because you're trying to multitask, but you're also context switching every time you go into a new one.
So it's just hard to mentally keep up and
Yeah.
stay focused. You made an interesting point that I really hadn't thought about, this idea that um, meetings, especially during COVID when we're all working from home and remotely, were the way we created FaceTime. And FaceTime is this illusion that you're present and doing work. I remember way back at the beginning of my career, even in my Army days, that if you wanted to get ahead, you needed to get into work before the boss showed up, and you needed to stay until the boss left to give the impression that you were a dedicated hard worker. And the irony of that is, I remember, people waiting till the moment the boss walked out the door and got in his car, and then there was this mad rush out the door, to follow him out. And I'm not sure that that was really a true representation of people's commitment and how hard they were working, but it was an illusion. And now with COVID, I mean, that was the way we did that sort of thing when we were all working with home. So I think that's interesting. Maybe I'm by myself here. I don't think I am, but do meetings are we sitting in so many meetings that we don't talking about projects and updating each other on projects and envisioning new projects that we don't have time to actually do any work? Is that me, or is that what you're experiencing in your consulting work as well?
I do see that. Obviously, their meetings are important to be able to update folks on what you're working on, removing any blockers that you have, and generally, meetings are and can be productive if done correctly. But when you're in a meeting simply because you were invited to one and you have no idea why you're just there kind of listening, then that's when the distraction comes in, where you could be focusing your energy on what Cal Newport likes to call deep work. If you like the book that you mentioned earlier, I forgot the title of it. Sorry.
Death by meeting.
Yes, Death by Meeting. I think you might enjoy Cal Newport's books as well.
So, I mentioned some research that HBR referenced about back in the 60s, the average executive spent about 10 hours a week in meetings. And that number has more than doubled to the average executive now spending as many as 23 hours per week in meetings. And I think in some cases it might be more than that. So is there so first of all, why do you think that is? And we talked about the COVID and the Zoom and the creating face with the FaceTime with our colleagues. But are there any other factors that have affected the increase in the number of hours we sit in meetings? What's different between 1963 and 2023? What's happened in those 60 years?
Yeah, that's a good question. I honestly, I think that there are more technologies available to be able to have those meetings. So that's a contributing factor. And to your point before of being physically present and participating actively in projects that other people are a witness to, it definitely it adds to that as well from my perspective. Um, but yeah, I also think that, our leaders are requiring more of us, and in turn, they're requiring more, of their teams.
So
So
how do we create what are the characteristics of a good meeting, uh, a planned, well designed, well executed meetings? I'm we're going to get to the point in our conversation where we talk about why fewer meetings can create more output and satisfaction. But how do we create a really good, productive meeting if we're going to have the meeting?
sure, I think having an agenda in place ahead of time is key. I'm sorry, my dog is barking. I think having an agenda up front is key. My team knows that if there's no agenda, unless it's a one-on-one where we're having a casual conversation or we're talking about something specific, that's a totally different story. But when we're bringing together a group of people and there's no agenda, it can create absolute chaos because someone can go on a tangent and then a new project is birthed as a result of a topic or something that was brought up in the meeting, and then it just snowballs into something else. So not having an agenda, I think, is a huge detriment to meeting productivity. And then the other thing that I think is, making sure that you're auditing who you're sending the invite to, so that there isn't this implicit expectation that if you receive this meeting invite, you have to be there. Because most times people are just added to a meeting just as a, nice to, it'd be, I don't know if you should be invited, but I'm going to invite you anyway, just in case. So that's another thing, is just making sure that you're inviting the right people, whether they're decision makers or if they're people that whose day to day is impacted by the conversation that's being had.
So we err on the side of inclusion
Yes.
and invite a bunch of people. Your point is that maybe all those people shouldn't be there. How do you, if I receive an invitation from a colleague, a peer, my boss, how do I decide whether I can tap out and say, pass, no, thank you. I'm not going to attend because I've got something else important I'm working on here. How do we do that in a graceful, professional way?
Sure. I think the question that you ask, if say I'm receiving the calendar invite, the first question I ask is, what is my level of contribution in this meeting? Or what is the level of contribution that you expect of me in this meeting, especially if I don't know what I'm being invited to. And that usually gives them a second to think about, why did I invite Jah-Dee? Is it a nice to know? And then at that point, you can make the determination. If you don't have anything to contribute actively, then all right, I'm going to pass on this one. But if there's if there's a follow up meeting that needs my input, I will join.
So you're saying that as a recipient of an invitation, if it comes from my boss or comes from a colleague, I can just go back and ask the question, what do you expect of me? And then I think you're also saying, as someone who's sending those invitations, maybe we should go down that mental checklist and ask ourselves, what in fact am I looking for from this person? Why is this person here? And would their time be better used elsewhere? So if I'm a team leader with a mission to accomplish, and I know there's lots of work that needs to be done, maybe I decide that's not the best use of that person's time to come sit with me for 2 hours in a meeting. Is that kind
Right.
of what you're saying?
Exactly.
So we just kind of clearly inquire as to what's expected of us. What if we've got one of those managers or a executive or peer, whoever the stakeholder is who's called the meeting? What if they just like to have people around them in meetings, and the more the merrier is kind of their mindset? How do you address that person?
Yeah, it's a very good question because personalities are a huge thing that come into play here, especially if they're in a leadership position and things like that. But I would say, be upfront and say, again, ask that question of what's the expectation of me to be in this meeting. And if there isn't a kind of a legitimate um active contributing role that you play, then I could say, can we delegate it to someone else, or do you have notes that you can share with me afterwards? Or there are going to be some times where you're sitting in a meeting and you may not be, maybe it's for situational awareness that your leaders are trying to contribute to a culture of transparency, which is also a valuable thing to have in your team. And it can go hand in hand with these meetings. And so there are going to be times where you have to use your discretion, where is this meeting going to reveal some sort of update, or is there something that some priorities that are coming down that are new, while you don't have an active role in it. Being the recipient of this information is just as helpful. So I think it's all about building trust within your teams to know when, from both parties, from yourself as an individual contributor and from your leadership, to know, hey, maybe Jah-Dee's not here because she's got something else that's taking priority. And knowing that that I'm going to invite you to this meeting for transparency's sake, and that I want you to be aware of things that are going on around the organization, that I just want you to be aware of. And
You bring up a good point there. Often those people who are calling the meetings have good intentions. Uh,
Sure.
we want to be transparent. We want to let everyone know what's going on in the business.
Mhm.
So and see how the decisions are made, see how the sausage is made, so to speak. And there could be some value in that, but it has to be weighed against the value of people's time and their ability to accomplish other work. Here's something I was thinking about. If we reduce our time in meetings, are we reducing our collaboration? Because
Mhm.
oftentimes meetings are set up as times where we collaborate and we share ideas and we brainstorm and we try to come up with new, more innovative approaches. Are we killing collaboration if we greatly reduce the time we spend in meetings? Are meetings and collaboration synonymous, or is that a misconception?
Yeah, I that's a very good point, and one that I often think about, because you kind of have to toe the line, right? Where you're not, overwhelming people with too many meetings, but then you're also able to build a connection and build across teams to be able to do all of these things that you're talking about, the innovation and new projects and things like that. And so I think that there are tools that you can utilize that maybe aren't a maybe you don't have to meet in real time. Are there certain meetings that you can use Loom for? If you've not used Loom before, I love it. I advocate for it fairly often, because it is an asynchronous meeting platform where you can record yourself, you know, giving updates and you know, whatever the purpose of the meeting is. And people can go in at whatever time they're available to watch the meeting, and then collaborate in the chat of the meeting. That's in, you know, it can be done asynchronously. So, are there some meetings that you can move to an async type of collaboration model? And the other thing too is that, you know, when you're having meetings, you know, make sure that they are for a specific purpose. If they're just to share updates or if they are to collaborate and brainstorm, it helps people be better prepared going into a brainstorming meeting, knowing that they're going to be brainstorming. And so, one of the examples that I use is that, you know, we've had my team and I have had a Wednesday meeting on the calendar that we've repurposed several times where, you know, we've repurposed it to be a brainstorming session. We've repurposed it to be a like a culture building, like a I don't want to call it a happy hour because, you know, no one's really drinking or anything, but, you know, a tea time, so to speak. So what meetings exist on your calendar that can be repurposed for the purpose of collaboration? So in I think I read a Harvard Business Review article recently that I wrote about on my blog that our natural inclination is to add more. And instead of adding more, you know, whether it's more technologies to your tech stack or more meetings to your calendar or just more in general, having less but more focused things are more productive and effective.
So
So
we
I,
built
that was,
we build
uh,
this episode as why fewer meetings lead to stronger teams. Is that is that the answer to that question? um, Less and more focus leads to stronger, more meaningful interactions. What do we mean when we say fewer meetings build stronger teams? Let's pay that off for the audience. What do we mean by that?
sure. One example of having a less is more mentality when it comes to meetings is the example that I use of my no meeting Fridays. So no, we have no meetings on Fridays. We are everyone on my team knows. Obviously, there are going to be times where we have, you know, client calls or, you know, stakeholder calls and things like that, that, you know, we just can't avoid them. But any regularly scheduled team meetings will not happen on a Friday. And that gives our teams an opportunity to just be able to breathe and work on things that they maybe didn't get to the rest of the week because they have been in meetings or because they just haven't been able to get around to it and things like that. So eliminating a full day of meetings will, you know, it helps to produce more because they're focusing their Fridays on producing. And then the other thought is that, you know, when we're having less meetings and we're being thoughtful, I think that's the most important part of it all, is that we're being thoughtful of our time and everyone else's time around us. There's that sense of respect and rapport that you're building with each other, and that I know that you, Dr. Mike, are going to respect my time and not put something on the calendar that maybe isn't, you know, isn't something that's urgent. So I think that also builds into the, you know, that trust factor that I've mentioned a few times.
So it sounds like trust and clear expectations are really necessary to make this fewer meetings build stronger teams mantra actually work and play out, because there is a degree of trust that's needed to say, especially if you're working with a remote team, you don't see these people, you don't walk by their desk and see them, working away there, that they are going to be focused and busy and productive on No Meeting Fridays, even though you may not see them and check in with them. And then the clarifying expectations piece is about, um, when we put meetings on the calendar, when we gather together, it's for a purpose, and we're coming together mindfully to pursue meaningful work, and we're really there to make something happen. So without clear expectations and trust, it seems like we default to, well, we better check in with people and have more meetings.
Yep, that's exactly right.
So, and I may have been mispronouncing your name throughout this episode. I think I've been referring to you as Yadi, but is that the way you pronounce your name, or has Dr. Mike committed a major podcast host error?
Yeah, I respond to Yadi and I respond to Jah-Dee. So I understand my parents were very creative in the pronunciation of my name. So I respond to either.
All right. Well, if you respond to either, but if you have a preference, verbally smack me around and get me on track here if I mispronounce your name again. Um, Jody, tell us a little bit about the work your agency does to help teams that are stretched thin. I love that expression, stretched thin, because that is what's happening on many lean teams. We're juggling a lot of projects and a lot of activities, and just we're doing a lot of work with fewer people these days, it seems like. So, how do you come alongside people and help them?
Sure. Yeah. That's a very good question. Because I find that I end up becoming my client's BFF. In that I take a two-pronged approach to the work that we do with them. The first, initially when someone comes to us, it's because they have an urgent need, because they are, they're too busy, and to the point that you just made, they're just stretched way too thin, and they have this back burner project that they have going on, that they just aren't able to get to, and so they bring my team and I on to kind of be an extension of their team, to be able to complete any of the backlog work that needs to be done, or just take on project specific work. And so while we're doing that, I'm also kind of, talking to the client to say, how did we get to this position where you need my help so desperately? The work is going to be done, but let's make it so that we're not in this position 3-4 months from now, where you're calling us to help clean up another mess, or supporting in an urgent matter. And so usually, the topic of SOPs come up, standard operating procedures. I feel very strongly that SOPs are the foundation of every organization, and how people work together and work better together. In that there's no gray area about the way something should be done, because it's been outlined, and you don't have to keep answering the same questions over and over again, because you've already set the standard, you know exactly what you're doing, and then we go from there. So that's kind of the two-pronged approach that that my team and I take. And sometimes it's hey, we just need a little bit of help, cleaning up our books, or doing some recruiting or something like that. And that's perfectly fine. So we kind of uh, add a layer of value to their team to be able to just breathe and focus on the work that's important to them.
So, do you have a client success story you'd like to share? I'm sure there's someone listening who's thinking, "Hey, I could use that kind of help." I'm feeling stretched thin, so maybe I'll reach out to Jody and her team. But do you have a client success story that you could share to give people, kind of paint a verbal picture about how you have in fact helped a client?
Sure. One of my most recent successes, and one that I'm really proud of, is that we had a client who received a sudden influx of work that they were not expecting. They onboarded a new client that had, they went into it thinking that the volume of work is going to be one thing, but then they soon learned that it was a lot more work than they were expecting. So they didn't have the staff, they didn't have the processes yet in place to be able to manage that workload. And so I came in with my team to kind of help them clean up their, reconciliations and things like that for the billing that they were going to be submitting to their client. And so, within, I want to say, I can't remember the exact, window of time, but I want to say about 12 weeks, we were able to help them reconcile about $12-ish million worth of work that they ended up billing to the client so that they could focus on building that groundwork to making sure that their automations are set up and that their team is exactly where it needs to be able to kind of continue working on this workload that they've just kind of received.
So in that case, you were helping the client with a good problem.
Exactly.
They were overwhelmed by work. They needed to get it all tied together so they could bill the client and recognize that revenue. So you stepped in and helped put $12 million into this organization's coffers, and that's a good thing.
Yeah.
Jah-Dee, it's I can't believe how quickly these conversations go by, but as my listeners know, the last question I always ask my guest is this: give us one piece of advice that we can begin putting into practice right away, maybe when we go back to work on Monday, that will help us build a stronger team, become a more effective leader, get more done, experience less stress. Give us one practical piece of advice.
Well, this is a good one. I have so many. The first thing that I would do when you come into work on Monday, to achieve all the things that you've listed, is to do an audit of your calendar, especially if you're a manager or if you are a leader. And even as an individual contributor, do an audit of your calendar. And if you are the person that's scheduling these meetings, take a look at them and say, because sometimes we have meetings that have been reoccurring for about 3 years and like maybe 2 people show up at this point, and it's not a good use of anyone's time. But it's just there because that's the way we've always done it, right? I would say, do an audit of the meetings that you have and get a gauge for whether or not they're necessary if you are the originator of the meeting. And so I think that would be the first place that I would start. But I actually have a downloadable file on my website for 4 things that you can do today to help alleviate some of the pressure and the stress from your teams and make them happier and more efficient. So if your listeners are interested in getting that download, they can always just go to my website and see that there.
Well, that sounds like a great offer, a great resource. And to my listeners, you can access this resource and connect with Jah-Dee through her website and any of the social platforms that I have listed in the show notes. I'm sure she would love to hear from you. You can get a free resource that will undoubtedly be valuable. And you've got a new friend. You've got a new friend who you may want to call on at some point in the future. So, Jah-Dee Ising, thanks for being a great guest on the Mission First People Always podcast. I hope you have a lot of new connections on your social platforms after people hear this conversation, because we all struggle with doing meetings better. Less is more when it comes to meetings. I love that mantra. So to my listeners, thank you. I believe you can greatly benefit from better meeting management. Fewer but more productive meetings is a great goal for all of us to embrace going forward, especially as we're moving into the latter part of the year. For some, the busiest season of the year. So we've got to manage our time and stay productive. And if this episode has been helpful to you, I would invite you to subscribe or follow, leave a review, tell a friend, put up a billboard, a television commercial, do something to help people find us, and keep listening to the Mission First People Always podcast. And until next time, be a great leader by treating people with dignity and respect. Clearly communicate the mission.
Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to create a stronger, more people-centric and empowered culture for your organization, visit drmikepatterson.com.